Hi, my name is Cathy Salustri, and I'm here today to talk to you about my road trips across Florida. I was at the library, I think it was about 2 years ago, and I was really looking forward to being with you this year in real life or in person, but it doesn't look like that's possible, so we're going to do this via Zoom. And at the end of the video, there will be links to email me with questions, ways to follow me on social media, uh, how to get my newsletter, podcast. So if you have any questions, please write them down and send them to me. I always happy to answer questions about Florida. So let's start with how I took this epic road trip across Florida before we go into some of the things I think you'll enjoy seeing. And we'll go back 10 years ago, actually, December 15th, 2010. I'm recording this on December 16th, 2020. So 10 years ago to the one day, I met with my graduate advisor at the University of South Florida. His name's Dr. Gary Mormino, and he's written extensively about Florida, knows almost everything there is to know about Florida. And again, this was at the University of South Florida, St. Petersburg, not so far from Anna Maria Island. And when I met with him, he suggested gently, if you know Dr. Mormino, Gary does everything gently. He's a very gentle soul. And he suggested that perhaps I should quit screwing around, get off my butt, and write my master's thesis and graduate it. I was enrolled in something called the Florida Studies Program. It's a Master's of Liberal Arts program. USF St. Pete is the only place you can get this degree. It's very specialized, but it is a liberal arts program. So students who enter the master's program take a interdisciplinary range of classes. So we take classes in Florida history, culture, food, anything to do with Florida, there could be a course on it. And all of us picked our own area of specialization. I had friends who did their master's work on pocket parks in Florida. And those are the little parks you'll see, maybe a right of way that isn't really a full park with facilities, but it's a nice little public space where you can go and simply enjoy being outside. I had another friend who did her master's thesis on a very unusual religious group called the Koreshan Unity, who believed that they were on the earth, but the earth was actually the inside, and we were living on the inside of the earth, and they settled in Fort Myers. So people had their own areas of studies. I had taken my time with the program. I started the program in 2007, and I was not what you would call motivated to finish it. And that's not because I didn't love the coursework. It's actually the opposite. I loved this program. I would go back and get my PhD in Florida history and culture today if it wasn't going to be an $80,000 exercise in futility. Um, Anyone who knows me knows that I am a little bit obsessed with Florida. Uh, I my husband and I own a small newspaper, and my staff jokes that when they get in trouble, I punish them with Florida facts. And I say, no, that's not punishment. That means you've done something good. I just love to talk about Florida. So when I found out that there was a master's degree in Florida studies that I could get, I felt I joked that the mothership was calling me home. So I didn't waste any time enrolling and sucking in all the Florida I could get. Um, Now, again, I loved grad school, but I wasn't motivated to graduate. And I also wasn't a type A student. I really enjoy learning and I enjoyed all the reading, but I wasn't so obsessive about it that I got laser focused. I would go down a lot of rabbit holes in my research where I'd be reading about one thing or doing one thing, and I'd come across something random and I would follow that research to its conclusion. Um, but what I lacked in my ability to be so laser focused, I made up for it to with my enthusiasm to find all these very unknown and underloved, I guess is the best word, things about Florida. And that's what happened in my very first semester in the program. See, I was a graduate assistant, and since I was a graduate assistant, I got all the glorious jobs. I made copies of assigned readings because a lot of what we had to read were passages from books that were either out of print or perhaps the professors felt like they shouldn't make us pay $80 to get a book when we were going to read maybe 50 pages of the 2,000 pages in it. So I would spend a lot of my time in the office of it. Our program was based in an old Victorian two-story house called the Snell House, and I would spend a lot of time in the office of the Snell House making copies of different things from different books. One of the things I made copies of I made, and of course it was multiple sets of copies. And one of the sets of copies I made came from a book called Florida, A Guide to the Southernmost State. And it was part of the American Guide series. It was a Works Progress Administration era tour book of Florida. It was a guide to motorists to use as they navigated Florida's main roads, hopefully avoiding cows and rattlesnakes along the way. And those are two things that are mentioned over and over again. We'll get to that. 1930s Florida was very different than Florida today, and in a lot of ways, though, it was still the same. So anyway, I'm making these copies, and I'm making these copies on a public school copier, which is to say it isn't exactly top of the line fast or good. And most of the rest of the class, we're going to get photocopies from the front part of this book. I have a copy of this book here, kind of falling apart, but you can see it's not a thin book. And the front of the book was all information that you would find in an almanac about Florida. Looking at it, you would see natural settings, industry, recreation, the countryside, major cities like at the time, St. Augustine, the Miami, Daytona Beach, Key West, Jacksonville, and then some other lesser cities, which at the time they considered to be Winter Haven, St. Petersburg, some other places. And it was all very general information. This is overwhelming amounts of things that you need to know if you're going to drive around in Florida. Now, in 1930s, driving around in Florida wasn't as simple as hopping in the Subaru and trucking down 41. You might get on 41, but parts of it might not be paved. So the book had all these warnings and guidelines for things like that. Most of the class saw about 20 pages of that front matter that I mentioned, the natural settings, the populations of the cities, things like that. But because I was lucky enough that I got to make copies, I looked in the back of the book, and the back of the book was very different. The back of the book was 22 driving tours to the state. And they were very plainly labeled, tours 1 through 22. And it was really a very different book than the almanac that they mentioned, the almanac type information that I mentioned, because it was intended to actually help people get out and drive the state. It was the ultimate road trip. So as I was prone to do, as I mentioned, I would get a little distracted with research. I let the copier machine just do what it was doing. Eventually it stopped, and I just kind of sank down on the floor, and I started reading these books, these tours. I started flipping through it, and I became engrossed. You see, I didn't know it yet, but one of the writers for this guidebook was Zora Neale Hurston, and another was Stetson Kennedy. They're two of Florida's, perhaps our finest folklorists, but I didn't know that. And all I knew was that this book made me want to travel Florida. And bear in mind, I already pretty much wanted to do that all the time. I love to drive around Florida. So I'm down on the floor. I'm reading this book. Flash forward 3 years, and I am getting ready to graduate. If only I could write this pesky thesis. I bought my first copy of this book, by the way, on eBay for about 50 cents. And I was very, very concerned that I had to pay $4 shipping because, we're conditioned now, we don't pay shipping anymore for things. These books today go anywhere from $80 to a couple $1,000s. They are out of print. So I had a copy. I have 2 or 3 copies now. They're not all in great shape. But I bought my copy. Now, flashback or forward from 2007 to 2010, and I'm sitting in Gary's office in front of his desk. He has this huge desk that's always covered with photocopied microfilm clippings. It was a huge mess. He knew where everything was, but it was just very overwhelming. And he wants to know, Cathy, what are you going to do for a thesis? And I tell him, well, you know how everyone else is doing all this really important stuff, like researching the future of the citrus industry in Florida, looking at the health of our drinking water supplies. And he goes, yeah, yeah. And I said, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to take a month off and I'm going to drive around Florida and then I'm going to write about it. And I'm going to use this tour book and these guides as kind of my baseline for what we see. Now, to Gary Mormino's credit, he did not laugh me out of his office, which really he should have done. He should have said, you are not taking a road trip and getting a master's degree for it. But instead what he says is, you know what, I think I can help you get a little money to pay for gas. And I left his office, drove to his house because he had offered to give me some of his sour oranges off his tree, and I like to use them to make pie. And I was really excited about this road trip I was going to take. But it wasn't as easy as just grabbing, a cooler full of sandwiches, a couple of pairs of shorts, throwing my dachshund in the car and going. Because the first thing I had to do is I had to figure out what happened to all these roads. See, this is the map that came with the book. I actually also have a copy here. They used to put these maps in the back pocket of the books. Usually if you find a book today, though, it's not going to have the map. But to give you an idea of the scale, and this is falling apart, this was the map that came with every book when it was new. And this is what they expected motorists to use to navigate their way around Florida. The problem with this in the 21st century is you cannot just put a road down in Florida in 1939, or more accurately, 1937, which is when the writers did the research. You can't just put it down and then pick it up again in 2010 and think that it's going to be in the same place. We are a state of construction. And not only do our roads shift a little bit as we pave them or widen them or route them around something, sometimes they were off by as much as half of a mile from the guide. They don't even have the same numbers anymore. So US 41 did. I know that's probably the one that's closest to y'all in Anna Maria, but many of them did not. And this was a problem because each of these 22 tours would start at mile 0, and every point of interest would be relative to that mile 0. So for example, one of the tours in the book is US 19. If you follow my cursor, you see it goes through Pinellas County, up through past Cedar Key, inland, and then runs up to 98, US 98, and then goes up through Tallahassee. Well, it starts in Monticello, right at the state line, and that's mile 0. And then maybe the first thing would be a half a mile from mile 0. The next thing might be 4 miles from mile 0, and so on and so forth until the last thing they have you see on the road is several hundred miles from mile 0. So being able to follow these tours depended very much on me knowing what had changed along each of those roads over the course of 70 some years. Because when a road gets paved and moves up to a half a mile away, and I did find roads that had shifted by at least that much, it's not possible just to follow US 19 or State Road 50 or US 41 and find your way completely through this. So it was actually about 6 months after that day in Gary's office before we could get ready to get on the road. I have to say my husband, who was not my husband at the time, he was a really good sport about this because he suffered through every step of this with me. I had this beautiful shiny red road atlas called the Florida Gazetteer, and I highly suggest everybody get one. And I went through each of the guide's 22 routes and tried to figure out where the roads went. And how it would work, I had a full-time job. I would work all day, have dinner. After dinner, I would clear off the dining room table, and I would pull out the atlas. I would pull out the book, and I would try and piecemeal together the roads and figure out where they went. I wondered often after the fact with me sitting there. He'd watch TV in the other room and he'd hear me swearing at this 1939 guidebook, hunched over the table with post-it notes and highlighters. Ultimately, what it became was kind of a geographic connect the dot between the cities mentioned along each route. I think he probably thought I was going a little crazy. I used to take the Gazetteer to talks and show people what it looked like, but it is so tattered, I don't even pull it out anymore. And my husband was so optimistic about this project that he offered to drive me for the month. So in September of 2011, a full 10 months after or almost 10 months after I had sat in Gary's office, we loaded up my little Dachshund, my laptop, some clothes, and a substantial amount of books and notebooks into a 21-foot road trek camper, and we started crossing the state. Now, we followed every mile that the guide writers did, with one exception, and I'm going to get to that. We created a new tour because in the 1930s, there was no A1A. If you look at this 1939 map of Florida, you notice that the route follows US 1 and it doesn't go out to these barrier islands. How US 1, the tour, worked in the guidebook is they started it actually at Yulee, took you out to the coast on US 1, and then they would direct drivers to go over a bridge out to one of the barrier islands, drive up and down the barrier island, go back over the bridge, head south on US 1 until they could get over to the sandbar again, drive up and down that sandbar and come out. So what we did is instead of driving US 1, we did A1A, which is mostly connected by bridges now. So that was the only change. Now the cool thing, before we move on, I want to talk about the really cool thing about these guides is that since they were written well before the advent of the Eisenhower interstate system, they're a pretty thorough tour book. I always tell people, go into a bookstore, go into a Barnes and Noble, and look around. And in Florida, they always have the Florida travel section. You will find books there for, oh gosh, traveling Florida with your kids, with your grandkids, with your dogs, with your grandkids and your dogs, with your dogs on a bike, with your grandkids on a motorcycle. I mean, there are literally so many specialized guides. And there are regional guides. There will be guides to traveling Florida's Gulf Coast, Florida's Forgotten Coast, Florida's Space Coast, Florida's Treasure Coast, Southwest Florida, how to kayak through Southeast Florida, how to camp in Northwest Florida. But what you won't find is a guidebook that simply says, here's Florida. If you drove it from end to end, this is what you would see. And that's important because now it seems like, to quote the Jimmy Buffett song, everybody's got a cousin in Miami. Well, everybody has a friend in Florida. Everybody has a family member in Florida. So they come visit Florida. And if you have a family member who lives in Holmes Beach, you stay at Holmes Beach. And you think that most of Florida probably looks like Holmes Beach. If you have a cousin who lives in Orlando, you go to Orlando and maybe you think Florida looks like Orlando everywhere. And Florida does not. Florida is so big and so different that it was really surprising to me that the more I looked, there was no, this is Florida for everyone guide. If you don't know anything about Florida and you're trying to decide where to go, well, here's your guidebook, read it and see which area appeals to you. And that's why it was so odd to me that the Works Progress Administration never updated the guide to the southernmost state. The writers toured Florida in 1937. The WPA published the book in 1939, and they would release more copies of it up through the late 50s, but they didn't change the information with those releases. So, almost 6 years after I decided to climb into this camper and run down all these old roads, the book about these travels actually got published because after it was my master's thesis, which they said it was probably the least academic master's thesis they'd ever seen. They then suggested I send it to a book publisher, and I did. And in 2016, the University Press of Florida published Backroads of Paradise with some minor tweaks to how it looked when it was my master's thesis. So what did I learn traveling 5,000 miles in this camper van across the state? And what would you want to see? What do you want to take away from a road trip like this? Well, obviously, the first thing I learned is that it's possible to put 5,000 unique miles on a car driving around Florida's back roads. Because towards the end of those 5,000 miles, you start to realize how long you've traveled. And the back roads, they were the main roads in the 30s, but as we built the interstate and they became the back roads, they were less and less traveled. So they're really interesting drives. I always try and take the back roads when I go somewhere, time allowing. Usually, what you'll see is that there's not that much of a difference in a driving time. It's that you can go faster on the interstate with less stops. A great example of this is if you wanted to drive from where I live in Gulfport. I'm right over the Skyway Bridge. If you wanted to drive over the Skyway Bridge, go to Gulfport and drive from Gulfport to Weeki Wachee, it is actually faster to drive US 19 than it is to take the Veterans Expressway, which becomes the Suncoast Parkway. The difference is US 19 has all these lights, and the parkways and interstates go much faster in your head. You feel like you're going faster because of that. So it is possible to put 5,000 unique miles on the back roads of Florida without ever getting on the interstate. I also learned that I was probably not designed to live in a 21-foot camper with another human being for 5,000 miles. It was a wonderful camper. We sold it a few years ago, and I actually regret doing that pretty much every day, more so in quarantine. But we had acquired a second dog and gone camping in it a few times where it rained, and 2 dogs and 2 humans in a Class B van is a bit much sometimes. I learned that Florida has a lot of cows, and this amazed me. The original guide at the beginning of each route had introductions for the start of each tour. And these introductions would list some of the cities a motorist would cross through if they drove the entire route, as well as pertinent details as to whether or not you could find a place to sleep if you wanted to spend the night, how easy it would be to find somewhere to get a cup of coffee or a meal. If the road was paved, oftentimes they were not paved roads in Florida. And also anything you want to be wary. And one of the things that came up in all but 2 of the tours at the beginning of the chapter as a significant threat was watch for cattle along the highway. Now, this is not this thing that we all do as we're driving along the road and we see cows and go, oh, look, cows. This was more, there are going to be cows standing in the middle of the road and you do not want to hit them. The state of Florida did not mandate fencing in cattle until 1946 or 1948. So it was not uncommon for ranchers to just let their cattle graze, and Florida wasn't very settled, especially in the peninsula where we live. So the cows would, from time to time, just make their way across US 41 or US 1 or anything like that. And if you weren't careful, you could hit one. Now, that did some damage to your car. I don't know if anybody here has ever hit a deer. Cows are bigger and heavier, and you don't want to do that. What was interesting to me is that of the 2 tours that didn't tell you to watch for cattle, one of them was US 27, where today you will find the spine of the state, most of our citrus, things like that. And then the other one was the section of US 41 that connects Naples to Miami. That section did say watch for rattlesnakes. What's very interesting to me is while the cows were presented as a danger in most of them, don't hit them. For this section of US 41, what they said was, well, you're probably going to want to stop and get some pictures of these snakes. Things have changed a little bit. You can still get excellent pictures of cattle in most of Florida. They are penned in. And if you drive that section of US 41, you're going to get some fantastic photos of alligators. I've never seen a snake in that section, although they're certainly there. And this was one of the things I thought was so interesting. Incidentally, cattle is one of the largest industries for a lot of Florida. And in fact, we are, I believe, the 8th largest state for cattle. in the country, and we are the first area of the United States to get cattle. Ponce de Leon brought over Andalusian cattle in the early 16th century, and the Seminole tribe of Florida, who is settled predominantly in South Florida, they still ranch those cattle today. Um, so that's the cattle warning, and I just want to leave you also with, from what I understand, if any of you follow the idea of factory farming of cattle and the horrible conditions that they're kept in, you should know that a lot of our Florida ranchers do not do that. That most cattle in Florida has access to room to range. They have plenty of land. Now, there are other problems endemic to cattle ranching in Florida, but that's another talk. But if you want to see this part of Florida today, I think the best area you can drive is 441. You would go State Road 60 to 441. That's Yeehaw Junction. Everybody's heard of Yeehaw Junction. And then head south and you'll see the Likes Ranch. You'll see a lot of cattle. So that's one place that you'd probably like to see if you're fascinated by the idea that we're a huge cattle state. Oh, what else did I learn? What else can you learn and travel to? I learned that we are so much more than beaches. This is the town of Leno, which today is Olino State Park. And I want to make it clear that I moved to Florida when I was 7. My family moved to Clearwater in Pinellas County. Today, I live in Gulfport, which is just the south end of Pinellas County. I am less than a mile from a beach. And some of my favorite parts of the state are beaches, which I'm sure, since I'm speaking to a group of y'all at Anna Maria Island today, that is also one of your favorite parts too. I never really understood why people would move to Florida if they weren't going to move by the beach. I actually thought it was just silly. Why would you move to Florida if you don't want to be by a sandy beach? I never expected when I started this road trip that I would fall in love with the red clay and cotton in the Panhandle, or find myself up in Olino State Park, which that's a picture you see right there, and think, okay, I could live here if I had to. It wouldn't be a hardship. Now, Olino is a state park, and it has a great little story about it. And it's not not a funny story, but I get a lot of humor out of it, because the town was initially named Keno, as you can see, for a variation of lotto gambling, supposedly. Now, the sign here that you see says ecclesiastical and commercial pressure changed the name to Leno. Well, that's not the full story. What happened was the town of Keno in the mid 1800s or the late 1800s wanted a post office. And so they applied with the Postmaster General, and the Postmaster General said, oh, no, no, no. You have a name that is associated with gambling. We cannot let you have a post office. So they simply, I guess, got together and said, well, let's just shift it down to Leno. Change the name to Leno, and they got their post office. What they didn't get, and why the name changed yet again, is they didn't get a stop on the railroad as it came through Florida. And not having a stop on the railroad meant that a lot of the people who lived there moved to areas where there would be a depot so that they could more easily get their goods. And Leno became something of a ghost town. However, it was still absolutely beautiful. And people would go there on the weekends. They would go there on holidays for picnics. They would go there to swim. And they would say, hey, where are you going this weekend? Well, I'm going to go over to Old Leno. And that, of course, eventually got shortened to where it became known as Olino. So it sounds very Irish. It is not very Irish at all. It simply means Olino, Old Leno. This is a central north area of the peninsula. It is a day's drive, and they do have camping there, I believe, but you can also find places to stay nearby. It's not very settled. It's really for people who like to wander around outside. There's some great photography and wildlife watching, and you can walk through it and see some of the buildings at the park. This was a park that still has log cabins. It has some WPA buildings that the WPA built during the Great Depression. And it's just a nice day outside in the park. Mm. Everybody's always kind of shudders when I show this picture. But I always like to talk when I talk about going to Florida and getting out and walking around outside. I want to talk about snakes because I gave a talk, I guess it was 2 years ago now, and a woman raised her hand at the end of the talk and she said, well, I want to go to the Everglades, but I don't want to get bitten by a snake. So how can I do that? And I realized that the more we see weird Florida in the news, these headlines of this massive gator going through a Naples golf course and iguanas dropping out of trees and pythons eating everything in the Everglades, it might do something more than get us media attention. It might actually make people afraid to go to these places. So, snakes. I have seen a snake in wild Florida, outdoor Florida, not in a zoo or a park setting where they have it in captivity, exactly 3 or 4 times in my life. I saw a coral snake at a Clearwater Park. I saw a water snake up by Wakulla Springs State Park outside of Tallahassee. I saw another water snake in Clam Bayou, which is a little kayak trail by my house. Saw a rattlesnake in my backyard once, but it was a pygmy rattlesnake, so I'm not sure that counts, even though they're pretty aggressive. And I guess I saw a snake kayaking on the Peace River. And then this March, before we all went into quarantine, March of 2020, I was at Big Cypress National Preserve. And not only did I see a cottonmouth, I almost stepped on one. It was only the park ranger who stopped me from doing it. But I spent a lot of time outside in Florida, and snakes are elusive. They're hard to see. They are resilient, they are adaptive, and they live almost everywhere in Florida. But I wanted to reassure you that we have very few venomous snakes. What you're seeing here is a grown cottonmouth. I did not take this picture. Cottonmouths will actually rustle their tail across deadfall leaves and branches to make it sound like they're a rattlesnake, so people will get away. The older snakes are quite good at avoiding people, even though they do live near us. Now, to kind of drive home how hard it is to get bit by a snake, and I'm certainly not suggesting you reach out and pick one up, I want to tell you a story that happened when we were driving the Great Florida Road Trip. We stopped for the very first night at Talbot Island, Little Talbot Island State Park. Now, the best real estate on Florida's northeast beaches are all state parks because you have Fort Clinch, Amelia Island, Big Talbot and Little Talbot State Parks, Pumpkin Hill Creek Preserve, Yellow Bluff Fort, Fort George Island State Park, and they just dot this part of the state. And they are palm trees and sand dunes and hiking trails and wildlife. It's a big change because the farther south you go, the more you're going to see development. This part of A1A is called the Buccaneer Trail, and it is just beautiful. It is sand dunes that you will drive through, driftwood. Every now and then the palm trees will part and you can see slivers of the Atlantic. We drove this area on New Year's Day 2020, and we saw a right whale with her calf just offshore, which is they're incredibly endangered animals. And it's really quite a bit of nature. So the first night we were on our trip, we stopped at Little Talbot Island State Park, and we were about 150 feet from the water, and I saw a fisherman crouched by the shore, and he was holding a rattlesnake by its head under the water. He was trying to drown it, which was heartbreaking. He had actually caught it while he was fishing, and he wanted to say, he kept telling me, they can swim if they want to, and please don't tell anybody I'm doing this. This is illegal. It's also cruel. The snake just wanted to swim away. The man continued this way for a few minutes, trying to stuff its head under the water, trying to drown the snake, which you cannot do, until his friend convinced him just to release it. And the guy threw the snake. It felt very bad for the snake, but at least he didn't kill it. And then the point of me telling you that is this man was handling the snake by the head and didn't get bit. So if you're careful and you're conscious of your surroundings and you don't decide to grab a snake out in the wild, you're not really in any danger from that. Snakes are part of Florida's environment. They are a crucial part, and a lot of the snakes that we see in our yards, black snakes, are actually great. They eat venomous snakes. So don't worry so much about being outside. It's not as much of a danger as the news would have you to believe. Get off the snake slide now. I'll be right back. My apologies, it was just getting a little dark. All right. Let's talk about the other part of Florida, and that's rain. We are at the mercy of hurricanes where we live, where you live and where I live. But as we travel across Florida, I realized that while we dread hurricanes down here, they're not always a bad thing in some parts of the state. This is a shot of low water. Now, I traveled on this road trip in September, which is right after our wet season. And in fact, this year, September was very wet indeed. So was October and November. But September is supposed to be a very wet month. There should be a lot of water in places. But while we were driving through Florida in September of 2011, we had some plans. We were going to go to Falling Waters State Park, which is in the middle of the Panhandle, and it is known for having a wonderful waterfall that you can go see. That's the name of the park, Falling Waters. But when we were there was no waterfall. It was dry. One of the other things we wanted to do by the Florida, Georgia, Alabama border, just outside of, just outside of Tallahassee, is we wanted to go and we wanted to see the rapids on the Chipola River. And if you didn't know Florida had rapids on its rivers, that's because most of the state is pretty flat. And as you go north in the state, it's not quite so flat, so you start to see some elevation, and when you see elevation, you will start to see rapids. The Chipola River is one such example. When it is, when the water level is, the river level is at least 59 feet above sea level, but not more than 64, you will see rapids. Now, they're not rapids like the Colorado River where you're going to have to get in the raft and put the helmet on and the flotation vest and go with a guide, but they're for people who are not used to rapids in Florida. They're pretty neat. It's about a mile walk in from the park entrance. So we called, because it said on the website to call before you brought a kayak in to get the rapids. Now, we weren't going to kayak, but we called and the ranger said, oh yeah, you can walk across that without even getting your feet wet. And I thought that was okay. Well, that's weird for September. And then I picked up a local paper, and there was an interview with a Florida forest ranger, and he said, well, he was quoted as saying, we need rain with a name or else we're going to be in trouble. And it took me a minute. Rain with a name is a hurricane, and I couldn't imagine why somebody would say, well, we need a hurricane, because y'all know and I know we don't ask for hurricanes. Well, hurricanes are part of a nature cycle, and what hurricanes do in a lot of our state is they keep enough water on things so that they won't have fire. I don't know if anybody remembers in 1999, we had some pretty bad fires up in this area of the state in Tallahassee. I-10 was closed. I believe parts of 95 were closed because of the smoke. And that's part of the fire cycle too. If we didn't have humans here, this wouldn't be a big deal. Dead things accumulate on the forest floor or the park floor, branches, leaves, twigs, and they build up as kindling. And when they're dry enough, a lightning strike can start a fire. That fire will burn away the kindling and also keep the forests in line with how they grow. It keeps different ecosystems looking like different ecosystems. Well, the issue with it is now that we've moved to a lot of these wild areas or close to these. Everybody likes to live where there's a preserve or a park, but they don't think about the fire. We try and stay ahead of this. We try and stay ahead of the fire cycle. We do this with what's called controlled burns, where forest rangers or park rangers will set fires in areas that they know they can control to burn away the deadfall and keep the ecosystem intact, and doing it before it gets so much out of control that there's going to be a naturally started forest fire. Now, the problem is if the ground is too dry, they can't set those fires. And that was the concern of this forest ranger, was that in 2011, they hadn't had enough rainfall to set the fires, which meant that the fire danger was even higher. They needed a massive influx of rainfall to keep the panhandle from catching fire. So that's what they meant by rain with the name. And I mention that because those of us who grew up and live along the coast, we have a very different relationship with hurricanes. And it's really interesting to go into some of the north areas of Florida away from the beaches, go maybe 100 miles inland off US 98 to some of these forests and see how they are impacted, not just by the fire I mentioned, but by hurricanes, because it's very different. Really very unusual for me to find out. And while we're talking about those forest rangers and the park rangers, I wanted to just say that one of the things I learned, if you're going to do a road trip across Florida, take advantage of our state parks. And I don't simply mean using them for swimming or for camping or for tubing or snorkeling or any of the myriad of things you can do at our state parks. Talk to those park rangers, because I've always said to people that our park rangers should really be the ones working for the tourism board, because not only did every ranger we talked to go out of their way to explain anything I asked, and in one case, they went into their own historic archives at a state park to get me information no one else in the state had, called me back several days later. But they love to talk about where they work. The park rangers are perhaps some of the best stewards of our natural environment. They're also the ones who, once they realize you're there because you seriously want to learn about the area, they have a wealth of information to share. They are underpaid tour guides. They are an invaluable resource. So the next time you go to a Florida state park on a road trip, or even if it's closer to home, talk to the ranger and say, I'd like to know, what about your park don't most people know? What about your park do people not appreciate? What do you think the best thing is? And I promise you, the biggest problem you're going to have is not getting the information. It's going to be getting away from the enthusiastic park ranger, because they really do love to share their bits of the state. You can also get an annual pass to our parks. We have a family pass. It lasts for 1 year and it's about $127. That gets you into every park. I believe that it is for Ellie, Schiller, Homosassa Springs, and Weeki Wachee, if it's a family pass, I think you can only bring 4 people in because they have a higher admission rate. But that's one way to do a road trip through Florida and see some of our natural beauty, some of our cultural heritage. Because they're not just natural parks. We have the Ybor City State Museum State Park, which Ybor City Museum State Park in Ybor City. That's a cultural museum. We have the Barnacle site down in Miami. We have really some wonderful parks that can highlight whatever part of Florida you choose to visit. So I would definitely encourage you to take advantage of that resource as you road trip. So I think we're running out of time. I only have an hour. But I wanted to leave you with some thoughts here, and that is that people tend to misunderstand Florida. It's incredibly easy to write us off as Florida Man or Hicks or News of the Weird. but over 5,000 miles throughout every corner of Florida. I didn't meet anyone who fit those descriptions. The closest we got to that was somebody who was trying to drown a rattlesnake, and we're just going to hope that that takes care of itself in some way. Most of the people you will meet in Florida are absolutely delighted that you take an interest in their part of paradise. That's the other thing too, is that, I always thought the beach was paradise, but the more I traveled to some of these other areas, there's really beauty everywhere in Florida. We are a very fortunate state that we have so many different iterations of paradise. I always tell people that Florida has a smattering of everything, remains more wild than you could possibly imagine, and is entirely unlike anything else you've ever known. These roads offer proof of how we have a little of everything, because every road showed us a different part of paradise. And the other thing is, everyone who has visited Florida judges the state by the part they've seen. But Florida, I tell people, is more than the sum of its parts. It is no secret that we do things differently down here. You've heard that before, right? That's not how we do it up north. It's a very popular refrain, and I get so tired of hearing it. We hear it in our bakeries, our pizzerias, our grocery stores. Bagels are better in Manhattan. Chicago hot dogs rock. Brooklyn beats Florida hands down in the pizza arena. But I always tell Floridians that no matter how many people try and tell you how wrong we've got it down here, that's not true. Because no matter what it is, it's not how they do things up north. So I always like to tell people, well, actually, that's not how we do things down south. But it's okay. Things are different here. Things are different in the Sunshine State. And I always think every morning when I wake up here in this somewhat messed up, environmentally compromised, we can be criminally creative, wonderful, glorious state. I am so glad we don't have bagels the size of a dinner plate. And I love that finding a pizza that's any good is only slightly less difficult than finding the Holy Grail. I'm thrilled that our cheesesteaks and hard rolls don't compare to anything up north, because those things aren't ours. And as you travel through Florida and you start to look at what we do have, you will see what not having all those great things from up north has cleared the way for. We have Cuban sandwiches in Tampa. They were actually invented. The Cuban sandwich was invented in Tampa by Cubans, and not just Cubans. There were Italian immigrants and Jewish people who were immigrants, and they all came together to invent the Cuban sandwich. That's a whole great story in and of itself. Along the Gulf Coast, we have Gulf shrimp. We have Cedar Key clams, which are smaller than maybe what most people from New York are used to, but every bit as tasty. In Key West and the Florida Keys, we have key lime pies, which only happen in the Florida Keys, and that's a whole story too. Key lime pie grew about of necessity. It has a graham cracker crust because in the Keys, it's very hot and humid, and graham cracker, didn't rot as fast as traditional wheat flour. And key limes were really the only citrus that could grow there, and they were smaller because the soil in the Keys is limestone, and the branches couldn't reach down as far, so we had smaller limes. Condensed milk, because there was really nowhere to graze cattle and have fresh milk in the Keys, so we used cans of condensed milk. And that's really all you need for key lime pie. Eggs, of course, we have plenty of chickens. That's every recipe for key lime pie ever, is graham cracker, key limes, eggs, and condensed milk, sweetened condensed milk. And that happened, it was born of necessity in the Florida Keys. We have sour orange pies. You can get a great sour orange pie at the Yearling outside of Gainesville and Hawthorne at Marjorie Kinnan Rollins' namesake restaurant, the Yearling. And sour orange pie, for the first 500 years, we had oranges in Europe, and the first oranges in the New World, which really wasn't a New World, they were sour oranges. They were Seville oranges, and the oranges came to North America via Florida. So that's a historic pie that you probably won't find in any other state. So so yeah, we do things differently down here. It's not how they do it up north, and I think that's why we all live here. We can't claim Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, but we do have Ponce de Leon, who is the first Euro-American in the New World. We have Jean-Jacques Lemoyne, who did these artistic renderings of what they saw in Florida in the 16th century. We don't have Paul Bunyan, but we have this great guy, Toch Brown, who was a frontiersman down in the Everglades. He was a folk hero. He hunted things. He hunted animals until it became illegal to hunt the animals because they were endangered. He hunted birds for their feathers until it became illegal to that because they were endangered. He was a fisherman. He ran drugs. He that sounds much worse than it is. He was arrested for running drugs, but when he came home a hero because he said, you know, I never took a dime from the government. The Everglades is always provided. And today you can go down and see his grave in Everglades City. It's definitely not a tourist attraction. He has a book, Toch Brown, A Life in the Everglades, and he's the Florida Paul Bunyan. We don't have the founding fathers, but we do have founding mothers. We have the three Marjories. We have Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, Marjorie Carr, and Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. I always tell people Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings gave dignity to the voice of non-coastal Floridians. Marjorie Stoneman Douglas was instrumental in saving the Everglades, and Marjorie Harris Carr actually saved Florida from the Cross Florida Barge Canal, which would have forever altered the state anywhere south of Gainesville. We don't have Mount Rushmore or the Rockies or the Appalachian Trail. We do have the Swanee River, the Florida Keys, and the Everglades. I always tell people that just because I celebrate Florida doesn't mean I don't understand that we have some things that are wrong in the state. I'm not blind. We have problems bigger than mosquitoes, tiny bagels, and bad pizza. But we also have this amazing patchwork of cultures. I don't know any other state where you have so many cultures existing alongside each other. Now, you could say New York City, yes, but not New York State. New York State doesn't have the diversity that Florida does. And that's pretty special. Our history, our people, our cultures. When the Florida guide writers in the 1930s collected their folklore and their history and all their other information and created these 22 driving tours, they showed us that patchwork, which wasn't nearly as vast as it is now. They left future Floridians like you, like me, an amazing legacy. They showed us that Florida is truly greater than the sum of its parts. It's a big state, and we have a lot of different types of people in our state. It has the Deep South up in the Panhandle. We always say you have to go north to get south because the Deep South doesn't really start in Florida till you get to Gainesville. That there you're going to find pre-Civil War architecture that only exists because people were too poor to tear it down and rebuild, so they renovated it. We have the Kennedy culture of Southeast Florida, and we have the fish camps, cattle ranches, and citrus groves in the middle of the state. The WPA gave Florida another gift too, the Civilian Conservation Corps, where young men found work building our state parks. 8 of our state parks were built completely by the Civilian Conservation Corps. Closest to y'all at Anna Maria Island would be Myakka River and Hillsborough River State Parks. Those were both built by the CCC. Most of the parks are also within striking distance of the tours from the guide. Now, if you want to get a guide, you have to comb eBay, try and find it on A-Libris, and they're not going to be cheap. You can go to Google Play. They are the only digital book service that I know of that sells the guide. It is about $14 for the digital version, but Google Play, their books are not quite like a Kindle book or an Apple book, so the reading is a little clunkier, but you can definitely read the whole thing there. This is from Cars, which was a fantastic Disney Pixar movie. And I always show this at the end of this talk because there's this great line in this movie. I don't know if you realize it, but Cars, the setting for Cars and the premise for Cars was based on the old Route 66. So these two cars at one point in the movie are talking, and the small town car, who is the car in blue, is talking to this big city race car who's basically gotten lost and ended up on the back roads. She's telling him about a time when the interstate didn't exist. She says, yeah, back then cars came across the country a whole different way. The road didn't cut through the land like that interstate. It moved with the land, it rose, it fell, it curved. Cars didn't drive on it to make great time. They drove on it to have a great time. I traveled the roads from this original guide way before we had an interstate in Florida. And I promise you, if you follow these tours, you are not going to make good time, but you are going to have a fantastic time because you're going to see Florida in a way that most people never have the chance to see it. The roads tell us so much more than what's on the roadside as we drive by them. They really do show us a Florida that I believe we've all forgotten. I want to thank you all for having me here today, welcoming me into wherever you're watching this. I am really sorry, again, that I couldn't be there today to answer questions, talk more about Florida. Please feel free to reach out to me, Cathy Salustri @gmail. I have a Facebook page, Twitter, Instagram. I also have a monthly newsletter. There's a link to sign up for that. And I do have a Florida Spectacular podcast that you can find wherever you get your podcast. And my forthcoming book from the University Press of Florida has the working title, The Florida Spectacular. It is not going to be available for at least another year, but it is another book that deals with some of the best parts of Florida. So if you want a little taste of that, I always like to include it in my newsletter, and I welcome any questions, emails, concerns, things I didn't cover you wanted to know about, travel suggestions. I'm always happy to hand those out via email. I look forward to seeing you all again in person, and thank you so much for having me out here today. Have a wonderful day.